Hello and welcome to another Twine video with me, Dr. Connor McKeown. Hi, I make things in Twine sometimes if students ask me to and put them on YouTube because, I don't know, sometimes people want to know how to make things in Twine and I thought that might be useful. Is that a good introduction? Maybe. If you have anything you want to see me make in Twine, please let me know in the comments below and I'll try to make it. Today, what we're looking at is kind of a DVD menu interface that I made in Twine because a student mentioned it in class. So let's just jump straight into it and see what that looks like. It's kind of built on a stupid little Unity game that I built as another class example. So it might not make any sense, but you'll see that there's, a background. And then a very simple start screen that is a good thing to use because sometimes especially if you're using like video and audio in Twine, you need your users to engage with the browser window for those things to actually autoplay. Or sometimes in some browsers, they won't autoplay. In mobiles, it's a whole other thing with mobile. So yeah, that's for another day. But clicking on start, you can see this glorious, is it glorious? I don't know. You can see this menu that I have devised here where we have a bunch of little scenes that are arranged and, you can imagine clicking through these and maybe seeing different parts of a story. So maybe you could use this as part of an after credits menu where you could look at different parts of something, or maybe you could use this to tell a different kind of story where maybe you need to travel from place to place or something, and this just helps us out as players. Alternatively, what I had in mind when I designed this was I wanted to give students insight into how stories can listen to your actions and kind of change based on what you do. So, as a result, when you click on the various options in the game, it doesn't actually take you anywhere immediately. It actually just tells you that it knows that you've clicked those buttons, and it's only once you've clicked all four of them that it actually takes you to a different passage. Why would you do something like that? Well, imagine a game where you have to satisfy 4 different criteria, or, get the 4 orbs before you're able to enter the temple of Shalaksha. I don't know. Whatever. Apologies if that is a real temple somewhere. I did not know. Okay, looking back at the Twine itself though, there's quite a bit going on here, and I think on the one hand, there's the logic that makes all of this possible, and on the other hand, there is the appearance. And I think most students care more about how their Twine games look than the actual logic, and I think I'm going to break this into 2 parts. The first thing I'm going to do is look at the way I managed to get this to appear, and the second video I'm going to do is having a look at the logic underneath it that allows the DVD menu to kind of function. So, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the style sheet. So this game looks the way that it looks because I've set up a particular kind of style sheet, and the most important part of that style sheet is the use of a CSS grid. If you haven't seen my other videos on CSS grids, please do have a look at those now. But basically, a CSS grid is something that you can set up in Twine in order to make your stuff look a little bit more professional. So rather than your text and options just flowing one after the other, a CSS grid, a cascading style sheets grid, allows you to place things basically wherever you want them to be placed within the window of your game. So you'll notice the first thing I have in my style sheet here is a declaration for TW story. Now, if you are new to Twine, you might not know what that means, but basically Twine has a bunch of built-in story sheet stuff that apply to Twine exclusive elements. One of these is TW story, which is kind of the whole page. And another one is TW passage, which is where the majority of your gameplay will take place. And then there's also a TW link and TW sidebar, and those are all things that you can kind of customize to make your game look more unique and more like your own kind of thing. One thing you might then notice is for my main grid, I have called my class here a main grid. That might seem kind of interesting because on the one hand, for the background, I've used TW Story, but for the main place where I'm putting all of my images or videos, I'm using my own class that I'm calling main grid. Why not just use TW Passage? Well, I'm glad you asked, imaginary person. There is a reason for that, and it's the way Twine Harlow, which is what I'm using right now, which is kind of the basic out-of-the-box use-in-browser version of Twine, tends to work. So if you were to build this using Twine Harlow, you'll notice that things kind of jump around quite a lot. If you have built this where you assign all of the values to TW Passage instead of making your own class for the main grid. And the reason it's doing this is the way Twine Harlow is programmed. So the way Twine Harlow makes things is it uses JavaScript to kind of create a brand new web page every time you click on a hook or a link. And while that's really great and works really, really well, it does mean that if you try to apply big style changes to things like TW Passage or TW Story, every time that JavaScript is executed, it will kind of re-execute what is already loaded up by your browser. And it gives the effect of looking kind of like things happen twice. One place you might notice this especially is in things like animations. But all of that is to say that when you're building this, we are going to use something called a class, and we're going to call it whatever we want to call it. But in my case, I've gone ahead and called it main grid. You might see a lot of other people using container for this. People like to just call their main grids containers. Personally, I like main grid. It makes more sense to me that your main grid would be called the main grid. The most important phrase of all that you'll see used here is this phrase, display grid. It's kind of the master phrase for making a CSS grid. And the reason why is that what you're saying to your browser when you use display grid is you're saying that everything that appears within the space that you're defining for your browser should be displayed within a grid, and not just any grid, but they should be displayed in the grid that you then define after that. So you say display grid, and then you want to go ahead and write grid template columns and grid template rows. Now, if all this is a little confusing, don't worry, I'm going to include the HTML for this that you can go ahead and download, open in Twinery, and just play around with. What this basically means, though, this grid template columns, is that you are defining a grid with 2 columns, and within those columns, both of them should take up an equal amount of space, and for me, that's 50%. That can be anything you want it to be. They can be way more columns than 2, and they can be any amount of percentages, and it can go over 100% if you want them to go over 100%. In terms of the template rows, I've then used 2 different values. The first one is 25 vertical height, which is a scalable value, and then the second one is auto. I don't know why I chose auto. I think I was just kind of being lazy. Then I've also added some gaps. I've added a vertical gap of 2, and I've added a horizontal gap of 10. And that's the way that gap works. It goes vertical and horizontal. And I've also said that all items should be placed in my grid in the center. And what does that mean? Well, if we go ahead and look back at the game one more time, now that we understand it just a little bit more, well, what we can see is this big grid with our 2 columns separated into 2 equal rows with the little spaces in between them and all of the rest of the CSS that we defined. If you're ever confused about the CSS that you're working with, feel free to open your developer tools, whether that's in Firefox or in Chrome, and you can just have a look around and see all of the different elements and the way that they're placed. Especially helpful if you click on something like main grid or TW Passage, whatever you're using, you can then actually view the CSS grid as it's being rendered by the machine. And so I can see here, I can see that my gaps are where I expect them to be. There's no weirdness or anything like that. And that's an important point, because if you miss a very important step with Twine, it will render things completely crazily. So this is something I want to bring to your attention just now. While I'm defining my grid here, which is very, very useful, and I can start adding elements to that very soon, one important thing that I can't miss is that when I'm in my passage, where I'm actually going to define all of this stuff, I don't want to use any of Twine's built-in story style sheet right now. So what I'm going to do is use 3 curly braces at the beginning of my code and 3 curly braces at the end of my code. And what that says to Twine is, hey, I know you have a style sheet of your own. That's great and everything. I'm just not very interested right now. I think I will define my own. And that can be really useful sometimes, and it can be really detrimental other times. But in this case, because I've got such a specific style in my head that I want to use, I really can't be using Twine's. Going back to the style sheet then, what I want to talk about just now is this next element, which is, of course, the video element. And I've just called this vid, okay? The really only important thing to notice about this is that I have defined the height of my rows as 25 vertical height, and that is 25 units of the screen space that you have. And for whatever reason, I find in Twine, it generally pays to try to keep that well under 100 in total. Technically, it should be 1%. But I think maybe just because of the way Twine sets up a border box around the passage, you're better off trying to stick to something like a total sum of 50 or a total sum of something closer to 70 rather than 100, and then that way there's no spillover. But to make sure that my videos actually fit comfortably inside those rows, I've made sure to make sure that my videos are 23 vertical height, while my grid rows are 25 vertical height. So there's just a little bit of wiggle room there to make sure that nothing overlaps. So that kind of works. But if we move on slightly, you'll see next that what I've done is be very, very pedantic. And rather than just say, add items to my grid, one after the other in my passage, which kind of would work, I instead am going to be a lot more specific, and I'm going to actually define particular spaces within my grid that I want to add items to. And the first of these is item A. And what I'm doing here is defining a particular space within the grid that I want things to take up. So grid item A starts in the top left-hand corner, or grid column start 1. And it continues on until the next space within the grid column end 2. So basically it only takes up that first top left-hand corner, okay? At the same time, it's defined to only take up the grid row 1, and it ends at grid row 2. So it is only the top left-hand corner, okay? You don't have to define all of these specific things, and you can kind of see where things end up if you just add them to the grid as normal within your passage. But sometimes if you've got a very particular design in mind, it can be really helpful just to define clear spaces within your style sheet. So I'm not going to take you through all the rest of these, but to suffice it to say, if I have 2 straight columns with some rows, and then I have particular spaces within these, I've defined particular spaces for each of the objects that I wanted to add. What's important now is to try and understand how I've added these within divs in the passage in order to take up the space that I want. Okay, so what I've done here is gone ahead and started with my main grid. Ignore the logic for now, and I've said div class main grid. If you don't know, a div is basically just an empty space within a HTML language, and you say make these spaces, and then you start populating those spaces with content. So I've called this one div the main grid, and I've done that by using the class tag. So div class main grid, and then all of the things that I defined within my style sheet under the main grid class will be applied here. So following on from that, I've populated it with a series of other divs. When doing this, those rules that I set up for my CSS style sheet and the CSS grid, I'm then adding items to the grid in the order that it's expecting it. Okay, now technically you should be able to add the divs within your main grid in whatever order you want, and then shape them by the classes that you're using, because you've already defined which rows and columns they begin and end on. I haven't actually found this in my own experience though. In my own experience, if you don't add them and then treat them as if they're in the order that they're in, everything goes wrong. So you can almost write out your grid by just adding the divs that you want and then start filling it with content. So here I've added them in the order that you would expect, going from B down, or A down to H, and added the things that you want within those. Okay, so what do I have in my game? Let's look one last time here. So you can see that I've got a video, then an empty space, then a video, then an option, an empty space, and an option. So item, we would expect item A to be a video, item B to be a video, item C to be the options, etc. So let's look and see if that's the case, okay? Double check here. We have this main grid, and within that we have class item A is the video. Great. Let's look and see what item B is. It's the next video. Awesome. Item C is one of our options, and item D is the next one of our options. Great. And that's because I've got these two columns. The spaces in between are added just by those spaces that I added within the CSS style sheet, and it works that way. So now, you don't have to always make a DVD menu when you're doing this kind of thing. You can add whatever kind of content to a CSS grid that you like, but it just makes Twine games look a lot more interesting than they do out of the box. So, I hope you found that interesting. I will do another video where I go over the logic of this game, where you can see how you can click on an option and it will test and see if something is accurate. But other than that, let me know if there's another Twine thing that you want me to make. I'll make it up and have a video discussing it. Thanks very much.